Greetings, everyone. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to a Jazz Primer, 1954 to 1964. This is a show that has been pretty much requested from a bunch of viewers, and I figured the only guy that's going to help me do a show like this is the one sitting right next to me. So, Mike Antonelli in the house again. Well, actually, I'm in his house. We're at the Brewery at Orange County Hops in Walden, New York. And what we're going to do here today is basically for those of you who like jazz, or maybe haven't really exposed themselves too much to jazz, but want to know where to start, all right, for all the great jazz artists from the era 1954 to 1964, not including Miles Davis and John Coltrane,
right.
Okay, because those are the two main guys that have so much material in the discography. That warrants another show altogether, probably one for each.
Absolutely.
So today we're going to look at those really important artists and groups from that 10-year period, which the whole idea of that 10-year period, 54 to 64, was basically Mike's idea. He had it really, and Mike, maybe you can talk a little bit about why you chose that era.
First of all, Pete, once again, a pleasure. Thank you for having me on the show.
I'm always happy to have you on the show, and I'm always happy
to be here at the brewery. And I haven't had my first sip of the day, so before I start speaking,
cheers.
Maybe I'll do that. And this is Captain Jack IPA, and you're drinking
Alligator Ale. Cheers, everybody. Cheers. There we go. Now we got
Happy
this
New
party
Year.
started, right?
Yeah. New Year's coming up. Just a couple of days. So, 1954 to 1964. Let's talk about jazz history a little bit. Just very, very briefly, we had the traditional jazz era, and very loosely here. Started the big band period, the migration of jazz from New Orleans to Chicago to New York and so forth. The big band era, which ended or kind of started to filter away or kind of die out, let's say, due to the economics of keeping that many musicians on the road and playing all the time. So those big number bands with 16, 17 people started to die away from popularity, at least from the mainstream in the late 40s, when bebop came into prominence, which was an underground jazz music that was meant for really listening and not dancing, as opposed to the big bands, right? So the bebop artists of the 1940s and 1950s, they gave birth to a whole new crop of musicians that eventually ended up influencing and creating music in the jazz genre that is very, very approachable by a lot of people, which these musicians, some of them created fusion, which is a combination of jazz and blues and rock, very popular in the 70s, and which now has spawned new roots music of today. So this period from 1954 to 1964 was really the college of jazz on the street. So there were no jazz schools at this time, right? The Berklee College of Music, my alma mater, North Texas State, they were just dreams in the early 50s. They were just starting to get going. And the school, Indiana School out there with David Baker, those things, they weren't established quite yet. They were formative in those years, but they weren't established, okay? So the way to learn jazz is to learn it from the masters who have played the music beforehand. And one of the primary artists influencing this new hard bop genre, that's what we classify it now as hard bop, was a man named Art Blakey, who started a format that was kind of taken from the bebop era of the jazz quintet, which Miles Davis, of course, pioneered that as well, because he was one of the early beboppers with Charlie Parker. But anyway, Art Blakey, it was said back in the 50s, if you went to jazz school, you went to school with Art Blakey. You remember Art Blakey's band. Art Blakey and the pianist Horace Silver, who both had very long, lucrative careers. And I want to start with 1954 because this is a show about 10. The 10 best this, the 10 best that, whatever. So I'm going to give you the best 10 years prior to the British invasion.
Right.
So we take 1964 as the stopping point, even though it's only a beginning, really, for a lot of these. So much great music came after that. But we're going to use 1964 as a stopping point, 1954 as a beginning with the first album released for Art Blakey and Horace Silver. They were co-leading this, and during this period in 1954, they had Kenny Dorham trumpet, Hank Mobley tenor sax, Dud Watkins bass, and like I said, Art Blakey and Horace Silver. Over the years, Blue Note Records. Over the years, you're going to be astonished at how many of my picks are Blue Note Records.
As mine as well.
And that's just who was hot.
Yeah.
Rudy Van Gelder and so forth.
I mean, Blue Note, Verve, Columbia.
Prestige.
I mean, there was basically like about maybe a half a dozen of the big jazz labels at the time.
So,
and
Art Blakey, go ahead.
I was going to say it's worth mentioning that Art Blakey and specifically the Jazz Messengers group was a breeding ground of musicians who went on from that band to greater fame on their own. Much like what was happening in Miles's band and Coltrane's band, right?
Absolutely.
Young musicians would go into this band, learn their chops, get some experience, and then boom, they were ready to take on the world.
Yeah, this was pretty much Art Blakey's band was the equivalent of a jazz musician learning the ropes, learning the craft from the community. And I mean, that's the essence of what this music is. It's a community effort by all the musicians involved. So just don't look at the headliners. Look at all the sidemen on these albums and who they eventually became in their own right, with leading their own groups, writing their own music. And I'll point some of them out. No less than 65 jazz artists played with Art Blakey over his career from 1950 to 1990. Yep. 65 I counted, and I'm not going to list them all for you if that's something you're into.
I have some I could throw at you.
Yeah.
Freddie Hubbard.
Yeah.
Wayne Shorter.
Yeah.
Lee Morgan. Hank Mobley. Donald Byrd. Chick Corea. Chuck Mangione. Johnny Griffin. Keith Jarrett. Woody Shaw. Bobby Timmons. The Marsalis brothers. I mean, these are all...
Even Michael Brecker.
Played at the end, right? Yeah.
Yes, he did. Briefly with Art Blakey, even though I don't think he recorded it. It was in
so that's a heavyweight list right there. A lot of great musicians came from Blakey's band. Or, whether they recorded with him or performed live, they had that experience of being around the master. And let me tell you something, that guy was a great drummer.
Yeah.
A great drummer.
So Art Blakey and Horace Silver, two of the most influential band leaders of this time period. Horace Silver is a who's who of pianists and all the people that he helped launch their careers, just as Art Blakey did with his groups.
And this is a live album, correct?
No.
No?
Oh, yes. Live at the Cafe Bohemia. This was recorded in 1953, I think.
Right about that time. It's one of the earlier ones.
Yeah.
He had a lot of really notable ones, both studio and
recorded
live.
in 54 and released in 1955.
Gotcha. And that happened a lot back in those days. They would record some of these jazz albums and they wouldn't get released on a label for like a year, 2, 3, 4 years sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
They would just sit on the shelves. And in many cases, these guys were recording 3, 4 albums a year.
Yep. So before we go on with Night, this is from Live at the Cafe Bohemia. Actually, this is from 1956, recorded in 1955. But let's go back 2 years. 1954, I wanted to tell you about the importance of Art Blakey, but let's talk about what was happening in 1954. I don't have the copy of this album to show you, but I picked the best recording from 1954 for me was Clifford Brown and Max Roach, and the album is the same as the two co-leaders' name. That's what it was called. This featured Clifford Brown compositions, Jordu, Joy Spring, The Hood, Blues Walk. Featured Clifford Brown, Max Roach on drums, Richie Powell on keyboards, Harold Land, and George Morrow. And why this album is significant. Jazz has some quirky history facts, of historical facts that are kind of quirky. One of them is the fact that after Charlie Parker, so many jazz musicians got hooked on opiates and had to fight that battle as well as the battle of being a musician, being creative all the time. That's one of the quirky things about jazz, that since Charlie Parker, his tragic example, a lot of other jazz musicians followed suit.
And ironically enough, he left us just as this whole period was really starting to happen, right?
Yes. The other ironic, quirky thing, and sad but true, is the premature deaths of jazz musicians.
Yeah.
I'm going to read them off to you here that I acquired. The bassist Scott LaFaro, 25 years old. Fats Navarro, 26. Lee Morgan, 33 years. Charlie Parker, 34 years old. Coltrane, 40 years old. Clifford Brown and Richie Powell, the two people that were on that beautiful recording from 1954, both died the same day in a car accident. Clifford Brown was 25, Richie Powell was 24, the brother of the great pianist Bud Powell.
Yep.
Eric Dolphy,
he was
36
so great.
years old. Art Tatum, 47. Blue Mitchell, trumpeter, 49 years old. Pianist Bobby Timmons, who was very a longtime member of Art Blakey, 38 years old. Bud Powell, 43. Cannonball Adderley, 46. Oliver Nelson, 43 years old.
Not one made it to 50.
Yeah.
Hard lives, right?
Yeah. So that's another quirky, insane fact. And where would this music have gone if those handful of premier musicians were still here or lived, lived another
years.
10, 20 years?
Yeah.
It would have been fantastic. All right, so that was 1954.
Good year.
You want me to go for 1955?
Go ahead.
Or are you gonna go?
Yeah, I'm going to kind of just add stuff as we go along
Okay.
because I've got like albums and artists that I'm going to kind of plug in as we're going along here.
So 1955, I picked the album Bohemia After Dark, featuring. It was an album released by Kenny Clark, the drummer, and check the lineup he had here. Paul Chambers on the bass, Horace Silver piano, Jerome Richardson tenor sax, Donald Byrd trumpet, Cannonball Adderley alto sax, and Nat Adderley cornet.
That's a pretty good lineup.
All of those people led bands in their own right and contributed so much to the music. Of course, Cannonball was also an artist who played with Miles. Paul Chambers, of course, was an artist that played a lot with Coltrane. So we can't escape the influence of Coltrane and Miles.
No, we really can't.
Donald Byrd also played on a few Coltrane albums. All right. So anyway, Bohemia After Dark. The album that I just mentioned to start the show, the Jazz Messengers at the Cafe Bohemia, that was 1956, recorded 1955. Art Blakey, Kenny Durham, Hank Mobley, Horace Silver, and Doug Watkins. You're going to hear a lot of repeated names because these guys all got to play with each other. So, also in 1956, I think you might have
year.
this
I
one.
got a bunch of 56.
56. Sonny Rollins, saxophone, Colossus. The great Sonny Rollins also played with Max Roach. He became Max Roach's tenor player after the death of Clifford Brown. He replaced Harold Land in the group. Saxophone Colossus from Sonny Rollins. He had Tommy Flanagan, Doug Watkins, and Max Roach, his favorite drummer at the time.
Recorded in Hackensack, New Jersey.
Yep.
By Mr. Rudy Van Gelder.
Van Gelder.
Remember that name, folks.
Yep. So, also in 1956, Sonny Rollins recorded the great recording album called Tender Madness.
Yes.
That's where he took Miles's group at the time, basically, and brought them in the studio and recorded. John Coltrane was a member of that group, and it was the only recording where Sonny Rollins and John Coltrane recorded together.
Yep.
Sonny is still with us.
The one and only.
He's 89 years old now. He lives in the Hudson Valley here in New York, and he's still with us. He's still a great guy to talk to. Tender Madness, Coltrane, Red Garland piano, Paul Chambers bass again, Philly Joe Jones the drummer on that track. So let's move on.
56. I got a couple of 56
go ahead.
I want to mention. How about introducing Johnny Griffin? his debut album, right? So that's with Wynton Kelly on piano, Curly Russell on bass, and Max Roach again on drums. Of course, Johnny Griffin was a very up-and-coming sax player at the time, and that was his first album, pretty much a smash for him. It led on to an even bigger album, which we'll get to in 57. A couple of the notable ones from 56. Let's see, we mentioned Sonny Rollins. Where's the rest of my 56s here? I thought I got one more. Maybe not. Okay, I got 57 to the rest of mine. So, okay, we can move on. 57 it is.
So, 57. Somebody who was credited with the founders of bebop. Now, this is like 12, 13 years later, coming into his own. He's always been very on the scene during this time, but one of his best recordings, in my opinion, Thelonious Monk, 1957, and he did a recording called Brilliant Corners, featuring Sonny Rollins, an little-known alto sax player named Ernie Henry, Oscar Pettiford on the bass, Max Roach on the drums, Clark Terry on the trumpet, another big name. Paul Chambers, of course, on the bass. Notable tunes on that, Monk tunes on that recording, Bemsha Swing, and Hananica. Very cool Monk tunes.
Yeah.
If you haven't heard those, check that out. So that's all I have for 57.
57. Let's go. Sonny Rollins again had another couple really incredible albums released that year on back to Blue Note. Volume 1 and Volume 2. Those were his first two recordings for the Blue Note label, released in 1957. Also in 57, the first of what would be 3 recordings released by Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers called A Night in Tunisia. So the very first one was released in 57. The big selling one would come later in 1960. Johnny Griffin again comes back with his sophomore release called A Blowing Session, which also included John Coltrane, also included Hank Mobley, Lee Morgan on trumpet, Wynton Kelly on piano, Paul Chambers on bass, and none other than Art Blakey on drums. And if that isn't one of the biggest like superstar sessions of the time, I don't know what else is, right? Is that all I got for? Yeah, I think that's all. That's all I got for 57. So I guess we can move on to 58. Yeah.
So 1958, we had the rise of Cannonball Adderley with his group as a leader, and he did an album that he was. Check out this lineup. It's called Something Else.
Oh, yeah.
By the way, Ornette Coleman also had a recording in 58 called Something Else. We'll get to him in a minute. But Cannonball's band was Miles Davis, Hank Jones, Sam Jones on bass, and Art Blakey on drums.
Yep. I think that's the only Cannonball Adderley I own.
Really?
Probably the one to have, right?
Yeah.
If you're only going to have one, right?
That's a very good one.
Yeah.
That's a very good one. I also want to mention in 1958, this is kind of off the beaten path, but 1958 was the first year of the Grammy Awards ceremony. The winner for Best Jazz Instrumental Album, it's not a hard bop album by any means, but it has to be mentioned here, for the first jazz recording to get the Grammy for Album of the Year, instrumental jazz performance, and dance band performance as well. The Atomic Basie.
There you go.
Which is the Count Basie Big Band.
Still an old veteran, still going at the time.
Still
right?
going,
Yep.
and made the first Grammy. That's something, so if nothing else, that's something that should be checked out from 1958. The Atomic Mr. Basie.
Oh, you know what we missed from 57? 6 pieces of silver.
Oh.
Right?
Yeah.
I knew I had another 57 on my list. Horace Silver, 6 pieces of silver, one of his probably 2 most famous albums, I would say, right?
Yep, I got another one coming up.
Yeah.
A little bit later.
Yep. And also, Jimmy, we haven't talked about Jimmy Smith.
Nope.
But he had probably his more popular stuff came out in the late 50s, early 60s. But he had a new sound of a new star in 1956. Jimmy Smith, of course, very famous Hammond B3 organ player, who I think revolutionized the instrument as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
And kind of really opened the doors for a lot of blues, jazz, and rock players in the 60s, 70s, and throughout. So, okay.
Him along with Shirley Scott.
Yeah.
Played with Stanley Turrentine.
Yep.
So 58, I still go back to a live recording from Thelonious Monk called Mysterioso, which was live from the 5 Spot Cafe in New York City, featuring Johnny Griffin on the tenor sax, Roy Haynes on the drums. Now, Roy Haynes is probably the most recorded drummer in the history of jazz. Over 100 albums.
Playing with everybody.
Absolutely.
Everybody.
So again, I want to reiterate, just go back to this point. There are so many recordings to pick from, and I'm just giving you a very, very basic, sugar-coated picture of what was out there. If you start digging, there's
It's endless.
You could make a show on the 10 best records from every single year here instead of the 10 years. You could do 10 records in every single year, but we want to keep this under
control,
a reasonable time
Exactly.
period, so we don't have to have breakfast here after.
Exactly. We can go out all night. Yeah, exactly. Also in '58, how about "Moanin'" by Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers? Another really great Art
So
Blakey.
I was going to get to that.
Oh, you were? Sorry, it stole your thunder, Mike.
But there's a discrepancy there. I think it was recorded in '58, but not released till 1959.
Oh, that could be. Okay, that could be.
So 1959 was a monumental year in jazz. In fact, we'll get to that in a second. I just want to mention, so I did Monk. I got that. All right, let's move ahead. So 1959 was the year that Kind of Blue was released. Miles Davis, monumental landmark recording, and probably more children were conceived from parents listening to Kind of Blue than any other record in the history of.
Yep.
I can't verify that for a fact. I was actually born in '61, so it wasn't me.
But you never know.
But
how about you, Sam?
never know.
You were born in '59. Were your parents listening to Kind of Blue?
No, Italian opera.
Italian opera. Okay, well, whatever. I don't know. But and I think that Kind of Blue is probably one of the handful of albums that the casual jazz fan probably has in their collection.
Yep.
Wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
That's like
the greatest selling jazz record of all time, actually.
Yeah.
So that's where I had "Moanin'" by Art Blakey. And again, Art Blakey with "Moanin'," this is where he has Lee Morgan on trumpet, Benny Golson on tenor sax, Bobby Timmons wrote the title track, and Jimmy Merritt was the bass player. But Benny Golson became, and is still with us again today, he became a great composer.
He's up there, right?
Yeah, he's also in his early 90s or late 80s, I believe. So that was 1959.
59.
Which was a really incredible year because Miles came out with this modal jazz concept, which is the Kind of Blue thing, which is something new at the time that no other bands or not many other bands were doing. But there were other groundbreaking albums that year, and I want to just point out a couple of them. First of all, "The Shape of Jazz to Come" by Ornette Coleman, who to the casual ear, even today, a lot of people who don't have a lot of jazz experience, listening to the music, still think that Ornette Coleman is kind of out there, off the beaten path,
kind of
off
noisy,
the mainstream.
Yeah.
But what he did was revolutionize the harmonic approach that no one had done since Charlie Parker, and before John Coltrane took a different approach in 1960 with giant steps, but we're going to stay away from that for now. So anyway, the one to note, "The Shape of Jazz to Come," Ornette Coleman as a leader. Also, we got this guy over here, Dave Brubeck, who recorded a very classic album that's one of the greatest sellers of all time as well, called "Time Out" with Paul Desmond. And then he recorded this other little bit lesser known album from Columbia, which is called "Time Further Out." And he shows you on here his different time signatures: Unsquare Dance in 7/4, Maori Blues in 6/4, It's a Raggy Waltz, which is a blues, but it's in 3/4 instead of in 4/4, Far More Blue in 5/4. So basically, that was his major claim, and his classic quartet with Joe Morello, Paul Desmond, and Eugene Wright. Time Further Out and Time Out by Dave Brubeck. So this was kind of like a follow-up to Time Out, a sequel. Back to the more avant-garde-ish, but this is more gospel and blues. First workshop jazz leader, bassist, who had several bands that were in the in his own style. Mingus, Better Get It In Your Soul, Goodbye Pork Pie Hat, Boogie Stop Shuffle, Self-Portrait in Three Colors, Fables of Faubus, about the politician Faubus. A very, very, very
melodic player.
Yeah, and a very influential band leader and musician on the scene. So if you haven't checked out any Mingus, this is a great Mingus to start with. And again, 1959 as a pivotal year when some of these, I don't want to call them strange, but different styles started to emerge, different concepts of how to play jazz. So he's very unique and original, as all these people are.
And he followed that up the same year with the Mingus Dynasty album, which, and I didn't know this until I started doing a little research. I've heard that album, it's very good, but Charlie Mingus is actually part Chinese. Okay, so he had a rich family history in Chinese culture. So what he did was he created this kind of bluesy jazz album with a lot of ethnic Chinese musical elements, which kind of, again, made that a very, very different sounding album from the album. But, and again, he's not one of those guys. It's not a bass album, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a kind of an ensemble album with his really rich melodic bass tones on the album, but not by any means is he like soloing all over all the tracks or anything like that. But really, really good compositions on it.
Moving ahead. All right.
Well, you know what? While we're in 58, do we want to at least talk about that?
59.
You want to talk about that?
yeah.
Arcane, I got the picture, so
Okay.
I'll pull it up. So some of you may have seen this, or maybe not. Hopefully you can kind of see this there. But if you've ever seen that picture there, Mike actually has a nice shot of this framed on his wall. This picture includes almost all the guys we're talking about and a
Many
lot
of them.
more. So Mike can give you a little bit more history of this. The Great Day in Harlem, it's called.
Yeah, I guess I'm not really familiar with how it came about, but in front of a brownstone, this in Harlem, 125th Street, I think, the photographer Art Kane got together all these jazz musicians who were in town, playing around town, and I'm not sure exactly how he got them all together, but it's something you could certainly find out on some website. I'm sure there's information about that. But anyway,
Pretty incredible how many they got together for that shot.
it's amazing how many jazz musicians from the previous eras and right on through this era were in that. And I'm not going to name names because there's just too many.
Extensive, yeah.
But do yourself a favor if you're interested at all in learning more about this music. Look up that photo. Famous. It's called "A Great Day in Harlem" by Art Kane.
Kane.
Yeah, and you find the names of those people who are listed in that photo and start digging into their music, and that's a great place to get a great jazz education as a listener if you want a good place to begin. So
now the new decade begins.
Yeah. So in 1960, again, this is the time we're getting into the experimental phase of our generation, the baby boomers.
Yep.
And one of the greatest innovators, who we can't mention because we're not going to talk about him, made a recording called Giant Steps, where he had a very unique way of organizing jazz chord changes in a way that was a pattern that repeats itself and has since then become known as Giant Steps changes. And it's a way of reharmonizing music using a specific formula, which I'm not going to go into because that's a whole other show. And those of you who are just hanging by a little thread right here, I don't want to lose you.
And for those of you who are wondering who the hell we're
Giant
talking
Steps.
about, we're talking about John Coltrane, okay?
Yes.
So that's a story for another show. See that? I've already given you homework for next
Oh
time.
gosh, I love it when you give me homework, but I used to have more hair,
Till he met me about a year ago,
And it was
a year
dark.
and a half ago. Yeah.
it was darker.
Yes. Till I came along.
Yeah.
See that?
Thank you for that.
Gotta love these part-time jobs that I give people, right?
So during that same year, our old friend Horace Silver came out with this one called Horoscope, a critically acclaimed album, and it's one of his best, one of my favorites. Starts right out with a tune called Strollin', which is just a real melodic, happy tune. For those of you who are not, into long, drawn-out improvisations. In fact, Horace
more song-based
was
stuff,
known to have very melodic writing and intricate arrangements for 2 horns, 3 horns, and so forth, sometimes 4 horns. But he was known to tell the members in his band to keep the solo short. Like, say what you have to say, and then get out and let somebody else say something. And that was his thing. He did not like musicians to ramble on and play 25 choruses on one tune for 30 minutes. That was not his style. Anyway, the musicians on this quickly: Blue Mitchell, trumpet; Junior Cook, tenor sax; Horace Silver, piano; Gene Taylor, bass; Roy Brooks, drums. Ends with a very fiery, kind of classic Horace Silver, which has become a real favorite jazz standard kind of tune, which is called Nika's Dream, from this album right here.
Also from 1960, I mentioned it before, but A Night in Tunisia by Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. And again, that was the second of the 3 Night in Tunisia releases, in my opinion, the best. A red-hot lineup, and that was basically probably the height of the Art Blakey Jazz Messengers band, I would think, right around the turn of the decade.
So I can mention Art Blakey again, but this time he's a sideman in 1960 to introduce the first record as a leader for the saxophonist Hank Mobley.
Oh, yeah.
Hank Mobley's record of 1960 is called Soul Station. And if you want to hear a soulful jazz player, you've got to listen to Hank Mobley, especially during this early period. Wynton Kelly, piano; Paul Chambers, bass; Art Blakey, drums. Sounds like part of Coltrane's quartet.
Basically, yeah.
Hank Mobley got his old buddy Blakey to come into the studio and help him out with this. So I think it's very, very interesting for that. Also during that time period, this was from not previously released until, I don't think they found this out until 1976 from Arista Records, but this is a CD that was recorded during their late 50s to 1960. Lee Morgan, Hank Mobley, the A1 Sessions, previously unreleased.
Wow.
So, Artie Taylor's in Europe, Doug Watkins is gone, Hank Jones is in New York, and they seem to put this together with Lee Morgan, who also died young, very young. Lee Morgan was killed in 1972 in a senseless bathroom shooting. So this kind of came out after Lee Morgan's death, like previously unreleased.
It's a shame.
Yep. All right.
61.
Yep. Moving on. The first record that I have, a new trumpet player from the Midwest was on the scene, and he recorded an album with Oliver Nelson, and it's called Oliver Nelson Blues and the Abstract Truth. Very, very bluesy album, as it is in a title, featuring Oliver Nelson, composer and saxophone. Freddie Hubbard from the Midwest, making it to the New York scene. You'll hear a lot more of him in the 60s coming up. Eric Dolphy, great woodwind player. Bill Evans, great pianist, who also recorded a CD live at the Village Vanguard, which is said to by some to be the greatest trio live recording of all time. That was shortly before he died as well, and it features Scott LaFaro on bass, who died a month after that recording was made. and the great Paul Motion
Oh, he's awesome, yeah.
on drums with Bill Evans. So again, 61, very active year. Some great names that we previously have not heard a lot of now are coming into the forefront.
Yeah, and I want to mention from 61, talk about a guitar player. We haven't really talked much about guitar players yet on the show, but a guy named Grant Green.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, who kind of came like in the wake of Charlie Christian and Wes Montgomery, and he had a really great album in 1961 called Green Street. He was a little bit different because he didn't rely on like chords. He was more of like a single note guy, and his music was a mix of jazz and blues and a lot of Latin rhythms. So very different, very unique player who had a lot of really great albums throughout the 60s.
And I just want to throw in there too that I can kind of foreshadow that some of your listeners, some of your subscribers are going to say, well, you guys didn't mention, Stan Getz and the West Coast guys and all that. Well, that's a whole different school. We're talking basically hard bop here, which is pretty much the urban New York scene, a little bit of Chicago, a little bit of Detroit, but mostly the New York scene in the late 50s, early 60s. That was a certain school, a certain style that evolved here in New York. So, don't hate us for not including the whole West Coast scene, because that's a whole different show.
Yeah, it is.
And I can't really, say, well, we didn't include this bass player or that keyboardist or whatever, but we tried to give you the summary of who was who.
And again, remember, this is a primer. This is a primer. Right. So this is for folks who really are looking to get into jazz and like, well, where are some of the best places to go first? These are all really good choices.
Yeah. Okay, you want to move on?
62.
1962. Sonny Rollins emerged from a long solace of not playing, a long respite where he got himself clean, basically, and practiced for quite some time to work out some things for himself. And he came out with this album called The Bridge. Monumental Sonny Rollins recording from 1962. Also, this man right here, Jackie McLean, came out with Bluesnik. This featured Jackie McLean alto sax, Kenny Drew piano, Doug Watkins again on bass, Pete LaRocca on drums, and the great Freddie Hubbard on trumpet. This is a really great album if you want to hear somebody different than Charlie Parker or Cannonball Adderley or Sonny Stitt, but every bit as unique and stylistically innovative. You got to check this dude out, Jackie McLean.
Great.
Also, I didn't mention on here Art Pepper, who kind of came a little bit later, but everything I've ever heard from Art Pepper, I love. He hasn't ever disappointed on any recording I've ever heard him play. So, just some names of some alto saxophonists if you're into the sound of the alto that we've mentioned before.
So Mike mentioned Freddie Hubbard, so we're going to give a little Freddie Hubbard love here. So this is also from 62, Hubtones. So Freddie was very, very active throughout the 60s and also jumped into the jazz fusion fray right around 1970-71. This album has got Freddie on trumpet, James Spaulding on alto sax and flute, Herbie Hancock on piano. I think 18 years old, I think he was, when he recorded this album. Reggie Workman on bass and Clifford Jarvis on drums. And I also, I forgot to mention before, but in 61, Freddie also released Going Up and Ready for Freddie, two also very notable albums from him. For those of you fusion guys, check out his Red Clay album, which came out, I think, in 71 or 72. Also a very good album. But this is probably my favorite Freddie Hubbard right here, Hubtones.
Also mentioned in 1962 is an album by the great Oscar Peterson. Oscar Peterson did this trio release with the great Ray Brown, bassist, who played again with almost everybody. He was fantastic. Had his own trio as well, and the drummer Ed Thigpen. So this was another trio that's very different than Bill Evans. If you like the sound of a piano trio, check out the Bill Evans Live at the Vanguard. Also Bill Evans Waltz for Debbie, and also this Oscar Peterson trio called Night Train. It gives you a different contrasting styles of two very innovative pianists and how they differ stylistically. It's really a great listen.
Good stuff. 63 as we're moving on to the end here,
so
right?
We got 2 years left.
Yeah.
Till the Beatles invade us.
That's right, and then it's forever changed.
And
right?
it's forever changed. So, remember, during this time period in the late 50s and the early 60s, this is when the rise of the rock musicians kind of displaced the big band era musicians. People like Roy Orbison and Chubby Checker and Little Richard and the Johnny B. Good guitarist Chuck Berry. Yeah, all these musicians were coming on the scene, and they were courting the World War II generation away from the swing big band. At least the teenagers of that time period in the 50s and 60s, they were starting to enjoy and listen to rock and roll instead of the big band for dancing. So it was a crazy time period, and that's exactly when this hard bop movement was going on at the same time. So we put an end to it here in '64 because after that, things really started to shift around when the Beatles came and the Yardbirds and all the great British bands that kind of and also the great blues bands that were being so successful in Europe were finally being appreciated over here after that time period. But that's a different show. Why do I always go into a different show, Pete?
I don't know, because you want more work to do, I guess, right?
I want more hair.
We'll let the viewers dictate that, right?
Not more work. All right. Moving on to 1963.
Yeah.
A
lot of good ones.
Yeah, the coming of age of a great saxophonist, Joe Henderson.
Oh yeah.
Joe Henderson's first album was called Page One, featuring Kenny Dorham on trumpet, McCoy Tyner on piano, Butch Warren on the bass, and again Pete LaRocca on drums. Kenny Dorham's tune Blue Bossa became a jazz classic, very standard repertoire in the jazz genre, and also his tune from Joe Henderson called Record-a-Me or Remember Me was also on part of that 1963 release, Page One, Joe Henderson.
Yeah, I mean, 63 was a good year. You also had, from Thelonious Monk, you had Monk's Dream and Crisscross, arguably two of his better-known albums.
Yeah, Monk's Dream.
And, in case somebody's forgotten, Straight No Chaser and Round Midnight were written and performed by Thelonious Monk, and those are jazz standards. It just goes to show you how important that cat was to jazz music and music in general. Also from 63, an album called Conversations by someone that Mike mentioned before, Eric Dolphy, who for me is one of the more interesting guys from that era because he really had a different style of playing. So he was, he played clarinet, sax, and flute, basically woodwinds, but he would get the most uncanny sounds out of his instruments. I mean, he was really big. In fact, I was listening to Out to Lunch yesterday, and I'm like, God, I mean, he's bleating like a cow and like all sorts of different animals you would think you wouldn't think it was a human making these sounds. But the music is very cool, kind of avant-garde. I mean, some of his stuff almost borders on avant-garde or free jazz, but we're a little bit earlier than the free jazz period. But a very, very expressive player that I think brought something totally different to the game.
I would mention a guy who did a lot of recording for Atlantic Records during the early '60s as well. Rahsaan Roland Kirk, who was a multi-reed instrumentalist and was known for speaking into his flute while he was playing.
A huge influence for the rock folks on Ian Anderson from Jethro Tull.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Playing 2 or 3 saxophones at one time and playing unique instruments like the stretch and the mazzello and all these strange woodwind concoctions. So he was somebody. If you like the Eric Dolphy type of thing, then also check out Roland Kirk, Rahsaan Roland Kirk. You won't be disappointed.
Not at all.
Okay, are you ready to move on?
But the final year in this show, anyway.
Yep.
1964.
What do you got?
Let's see. All right, I got a couple here. First of all, a guy who played with Art Blakey and Miles Davis, and of course went on to form Weather Report and what have you. One of my favorite albums by him. Just made it in. I'm thinking this is either recorded in '64 and released in January '65, or made it in. I don't know. It's kind of borderline, but I'm going to throw it in anywhere. Wayne Shorter's Juju. A really terrific album.
Tom Thumb on that recording?
That has Tom Thumb is not on this one.
All right, so Tom Thumb is on then the one that I picked, which is from 1964, Wayne Shorter, which is called "Speak No Evil."
Oh yeah, that's awesome. And is that the same lineup as this one? So we got Elvin Jones on here, Reggie Workman on bass, and McCoy Tyner. It's got to be the same lineup, I would think. Who knows? It's got to be. It's got to be. Or if not, it's pretty similar.
I did not have that listed, the personnel on there, but.
I forgot one from '63. I'll just throw it out here real quick. Dexter Gordon's "Our Man in Paris," fantastic album.
Another musician, jazz musician, who moved to Europe during his career because he could. It was more appreciated. His music was more appreciated at that time overseas than it was here, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So.
And my last one for '64, before I turn it back over to Mike, is Herbie Hancock, "Empyrean Isles," a gorgeous album. With Ron Carter on bass, Freddie Hubbard on trumpet, and the great and very young at the time Tony Williams on drums.
Yep.
So again, both of these guys would, of course, become a part of Miles Davis's band for a number of years.
Yep.
And that's a great album.
And this is the same pick that I had, referencing the tune "Cantaloupe Island," which was a pretty big pop hit. In fact, it became, even in this day, Herbie is still making great music to this day. He's a Kennedy Center Honors recipient. He's a NEA Jazz Master, Herbie Hancock. And the tune "Cantaloupe Island" was actually used as a backing track for a hip-hop song a few years ago.
Go figure, right?
Yeah, I forget the name of the group who did it, but Us Three or something like that. I'm not sure. One of your listeners or subscribers will fill me in on that, please.
And we talk
do.
about songs where the artist or band would stretch out live. Cantaloupe Island would be that song for Herbie Hancock. I think on the album itself it was 5 minutes and change. He would play 10, 12, 15 minutes.
Really funky, bluesy, just nice laid back groove.
Yep.
And I think the tune was called "Flip Fantasia," that they used Herbie Hancock's "Cantaloupe Island" for the backing of the hip hop group.
Gotcha. Okay.
Who did that? And last one for me.
This is great. It's almost like we saved the best for last. That is a fantastic album.
Lee Morgan's "The Sidewinder," which had the hit song on there by the same title, "The Sidewinder," featuring, as you can see here, Joe Henderson, Barry Harris on piano, the great Bob Crenshaw on bass, and Billy Higgins, who went on to have a fantastic career. Billy Higgins as drumming, just a marvelous drummer, and
apparently this is Blue Note's best-selling jazz album ever.
Yeah, he made this tune, "The Sidewinder," made it to the Billboard Top 100. Oh, not just jazz, Billboard's Top 100.
Tough to do back in 1964, right?
Exactly, with the Beatles as your competition.
Yeah, exactly.
So that hopefully will give you a nice little primer to get started with.
So what we can do is, and I'll ask Mike for his notes, so what we'll do is we'll drop in the comments or in the description a listing of a lot of these albums that we talked about today. So that's part 2 of your assignment for today, tonight or tomorrow or something like that. Just send me the list of them, or I probably can. He's just going to give it to me. That's even better. Even better. I'll do it myself.
I like making quick work out of homework.
So I'll drop that in when I post this, so you guys at least have the list. But we would prefer you to listen to the show, and listen and watch the show first, and then go and then take that and do whatever you want with it. I urge anybody to go here, stay here on YouTube and pop any of these albums in. You can probably listen to all of them in their entirety right here on YouTube. go and investigate some of this stuff. There's some really fantastic music here. And again, some notable stuff here, some maybe a little more obscure stuff, but I think this is we call it a primer for a reason. This is a really good kind of first step into jazz from that period. And if you're someone who maybe is fairly familiar with jazz but haven't heard some of this stuff, even better, right?
By all means.
Yeah.
I mean, like I tried to explain in the beginning, we're just scratching the surface here. I mean, this is an incredibly expressive genre of music with great people throughout its history, and it continues to grow and evolve. So, as a listener, hopefully you will continue to grow and evolve and get a better appreciation. I would highly recommend a station. If I can do a plug, can I do a radio station plug? If you have access to Sirius XM radio, the nationally broadcast syndicated radio shows, one is called Real Jazz.
Real Jazz.
It's Sirius XM channel 67, and I want to give them a shout out because they routinely play many of these songs and keep this music alive through their radio broadcasts. So
check it out.
Real Jazz, Sirius Radio 67 XM.
Cool. So what might be coming next as far as like content for future shows on the jazz front? We have not forgotten we are going to do our top 10 Miles Davis albums at some point, okay, in the not too distant future. We've been talking about that one for a while. We wanted to do this one first. We might have to do a favorite Coltrane composition song or something relating to Coltrane, right? That's going to be tough, right? Did that guy ever record a bad song? I don't think so.
Could I just take a year off and go to a private island and just with my Coltrane collection?
You could do that.
Before we did, would you pay for that?
Oh, would I pay for it? Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I need some support, some backing. I would love to do that, but
You want me to just take over the brewery for a month or two, and you stay home and just immerse yourselves in Coltrane?
No, I really need to.
You need to go on an island somewhere.
I need to go away from the cold, away from the snow, and
I don't know, Sam. What do you think? Is this something I
sunshine
should
and
take?
sand? You know, if you really want me to dive into this and get the most out of it, I need a place to just kind of chill.
What do you guys think? Right? Anyway, we'll see what we can come up with. So thanks for joining us, guys. This has been a lot of fun. I love putting Mike to the test on some of the stuff. I thought he did a fantastic job preparing here and
Thank you, Pete.
Presenting here. So
Likewise, it's fun jibber jabbering with you as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Have your mom and dad back on the show. I think they are a great couple, and they have a great persona on camera.
Yeah,
Nice.
They don't know it yet, but I'm going to try and get them back on New Year's Eve. So 'cause
perfect.
they'll be at the house, so we'll see. Because everybody's asking for them again. It's like, oh, when's Mom and Dad coming back on the show? So Dad doesn't talk a lot, but Mom seems to be into it. She's always afraid to get on camera, and as soon as the 1, 2, 3 go, 3, 2, 1 go, she's all into it. So they'll be back. So in the meantime, this is on the web at www.seatranquility.org. We're on Facebook. We're on Twitter. Of course, we're here on YouTube.
All the damn time.
That's right, Sam. Thank you so much. So, guys, for Mike Antonelli and Alva and everybody here at the brewery, they're busy drinking and having a good
Live
time.
long and prosper, everybody.
Remember, go check out your jazz. Dive into all this stuff. We'll get the description of a lot of these albums. We'll get the title of a lot of these albums in the description, so you guys can go investigate. And we'll see you again real soon. Thanks, Mike.
Happy 2020.
Take care, guys. Whoop.
Cheers.
Cheers. Take care, everybody.